recommended discipline.
Now, do you have any recollection of whether there was a chain of command review form completed for this investigation?
I don't believe there was. This investigation was actually sent through the chain in a little bit different process because we wanted, it was a fairly lengthy investigation, number one, and number two, we wanted the review done fairly quickly. So it was, there were copies given out to each level of Officer Sanders' chain of command.
When you say done quickly, you wanted the chain of command review done quickly?
Correct.
Yeah. You don't mean that the investigation itself was rushed?
No.
Let me show you what I marked as Exhibit E. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
What is it?
It's an email that I sent to you on September 20th, 2011, in response to an email I had received from you the same day.
What is it I was requesting?
You had said that Officer Sanders had provided you with a copy of the investigation, that you had noted the absence of any chain of command complaint review form, and asked if that form had been completed, that I forward it either to you electronically or to make arrangements for him to pick up a copy.
And
then
the email above is your response to that?
correct.
And you prepared that email?
Yes.
I move to admit that as Exhibit E.
I object, it has double hearsay in it. It's an inquiry to one person about the comments of other people.
And what you responded with was that there was no chain of command review form completed for this investigation, but the deputy chief had advised you of the findings yesterday, which would have been Monday, September 19th, correct?
Correct.
And you inquired with Deputy Chief Monticelli as to the individual recommendations and findings for each level of the chain and the disciplinary recommendations from each. And you were advised that the following recommendations had been made. That Sergeant Houston recommended that the duty to use reasonable force and the abuse, improper treatment of a prisoner allegations be sustained, that the medical attention allegation be not sustained, and that he recommended a 15-day suspension. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Lieutenant Kelly was not present for the meeting as he was out of state. He sent his recommendation via email as concurring with the investigation, but he was unaware the chief was going to vacate the unfounded findings recommended by IA at the start of the meeting. The chief said these findings were an error since the event did occur. Were you present at that meeting that's referenced there?
Yes.
Okay. Did you hear the chief vacate the findings? Was that something you were present for?
Yes.
And if you were present at that part of the meeting, did you hear Sergeant Houston give his recommendation?
No.
Okay. And in fact, you wouldn't have, otherwise you wouldn't have had to ask Monticelli, right?
Correct.
Okay. Captain Nelson, Lieutenant Kelly, Captain Nelson recommended the duty to use reasonable force and the abuse, improper treatment of a prisoner allegations be sustained, recommended the medical attention allegation be not sustained, and he recommended a 15-day suspension. Then Deputy Chief Monticelli recommended the duty to use reasonable force and the abuse, improper treatment of a prisoner allegations be sustained, and recommended the medical attention allegation be not sustained, and he recommended a 30-day suspension, correct?
Correct.
And Chief Burton sustained all three allegations and is considering a 15-day suspension through termination as a range of punishment, correct?
Correct.
Do you have any understanding whether those were actually Sergeant Houston's, Captain Nelson's, and Deputy Chief Monticelli's recommendations?
I can only go on what I was told by Deputy Chief Monticelli.
Okay,
That's
I
what I'm
object
talking
to this
about
now.
here.
So he puts
Yeah,
it
this
in
is
double
This
hearsay.
is double hearsay, not for sure.
I need to clarify. Are you talking about what he told you for the email?
Correct. I inquired with him
Right.
what the recommendations were from each level and what the recommended discipline from each level was so that I could respond to your inquiry. I did not have a written chain of command review form to provide you,
Right.
so
Who was
I had to
him?
ask him. I'm sorry.
Who was him?
Deputy Chief Monticelli.
And my question is, despite what Deputy Chief Monticelli told you in response to your inquiry, do you have some other basis to know whether those were actually the recommendations of Sergeant Houston, Captain Nelson, and Deputy Chief Monticelli?
No.
Okay, thank you. Now, you were also aware that Chief Burton had to be talked into doing an internal affairs investigation in the first place, right?
I object to that speculation, unless you know.
Unless you know that is a speculation.
When you say he had to be talked into doing an internal affairs investigation, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Let me rephrase it. Did you have any understanding that Chief Burton was just going to bring Rob in and fire him immediately and not even do an IA investigation?
Yes.
And in fact, either you or Captain Bernhardt had to talk him into even doing an IA.
We had a conversation about the importance of letting the investigation take its course.
Who was we?
I know that Deputy Chief Bernhardt, she would have been captain back then. Me, the chief, Kavanaugh was present.
Okay. And the chief told you it didn't matter what IA found.
I object.
It wasn't going to change.
First of all, it's a privilege if I was there. If something happened when I wasn't there, okay. But what discussions they have with their attorney when I'm in the room is completely privileged and outside the scope.
Well, I think for purposes of this hearing, that privilege is waived because we're talking about the conduct of the investigation.
No, I think he has a right to an attorney. And you probably talk things with your client in confidence, and we're not asking you about that.
Okay, all right. So as far as that meeting goes, I agree, I understand. As far as that meeting goes, Kavanaugh was present.
Correct.
Okay, did you have any other meetings after that meeting where Kavanaugh or an attorney was not present, where you discussed the chief saying something along the lines of it didn't matter what happened with the IA investigation?
Did I have a meeting with the chief?
No. And
Discuss that?
anybody else? Did you and Captain Bernhardt discuss it?
I'm sure that we did. It's been so long now that I wouldn't be able to tell you specifics when, where.
Was it your understanding that it didn't matter what your investigation came up with? He was going to fire Rob no matter what?
I felt strongly that he was going to fire him, regardless of what the outcome of the investigation was.
Because he conveyed that message to you, didn't he?
Yes.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Redirect.
Five. Let's start with, he did not fire Rob immediately, is that correct?
Correct.
And he did let the whole investigative process go forward, isn't that right?
The internal affairs investigation, yes.
And he let you take as much time as you needed, it took a long time to do that,
It took a long time to do that, correct?
and you came up with some recommendations, because that's what your job is that right?
Correct.
But the chief doesn't have to listen to those recommendations, does he?
No.
And no one in the chain of command has to listen to those recommendations, do they?
Nope.
And a matter of fact, a lot of them didn't, as was just put in the record, is that right?
Correct.
And absolutely most important, there were 3 distinct allegations, is that right?
There were.
And one of those is in Chapter 19, which is not in any policy or procedure that is in the police department, is that right?
Yes.
And does Chapter 19 apply to all city employees?
Yes.
And the facts of that would have been the abuse of improper treatment in this case of this prisoner, is that right?
Yes.
The circumstances of this whole case.
Yes.
And the actual guideline for corrective action as it's listed, so that's the charge, but as it's listed, it's actually a little broader than that even, isn't it?
I would have to read it.
Sorry. And what I'm showing you here is a page, let me see the page number real quick, I apologize. apologize.
63.
84. I'm looking at the notice of remedial action. This is the notice of the charges. Is that right? Under 19, not under IA. Oh, no. Go ahead and look at this page, 84.
Okay. This is the notice of remedial action to Officer Sanders from the chief.
And this is what you briefed from.
Yes,
And here, the entire, if you look at 19225.3, what's the entire verbiage in 19225.3?
abusive or improper treatment of a client, prisoner, citizen, or other individual in the community or on the city payroll.
So that's the global charge that applies to all city employees, right?
Yes,
And the specific charge was the abusive or improper treatment of the prisoner in that circumstance.
yes,
Completely separate from whether or not it was a reasonable use of force or whether or not he received medical attention. Is that right? Let me ask you this.
it's a separate allegation.
It's a separate allegation, and any facts that are abusive or improper could meet that requirement. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I would say so.
Now, it could be true that it is also, if you used unreasonable force, an abusive treatment. Is that true?
True,
And it could be true that if you failed to render medical attention, that it also could be abusive treatment or improper.
could be true.
And it also could be true if you had a duty to clean up somebody from mace, that could be abusive or improper. Is that true?
Yes,
Or it could be that you left somebody laying there too long. That could be abusive or improper.
yes,
Or it could be any number of things that fit within whatever the common definition of abusive or improper is. Is that right?
yes.
Let's go back a little bit in time. These holding cells, they're not made of paper, are they?
No,
Are they strong?
yes,
Are they secure?
yes, I would say so.
Is there a ring that you chain people to in them
Not anymore.
at the time?
Yes, there was.
And there's locks on these doors.
Yes,
And there's latches on these doors.
yes, and those are separate. The latches, and most officers would only close the latches a lot of times. That was something that we had to address with officers. They wouldn't, there was both a key lock and then the latch locks.
Do you think, from your observing of the video, that Baker was hurting himself when he was pounding on the door?
I don't believe in the video that you could see him pounding on the door. I'd have to go back and look, but I don't think that that part was actually shown on the video.
Was there any evidence that Internal Affairs could find that Baker was hurting himself by trying to get somebody's attention?
No, I don't believe there was any indication that he had hurt himself.
Was there any evidence in the Internal Affairs investigation that the lock was damaged?
I don't believe so.
When you commit a crime of property damage, you have to have an intent, don't you?
Yes,
You have to intend to break something. So if Baker's intent was just to get someone's attention, he wasn't trying to break anything. Is that right?
depending on his intent. If his intent was only to get someone's attention, then that wouldn't be the same as an intent to damage property.
I had asked you earlier if you believed that you were fair. Is that right?
Yes, you did ask me that.
And I also am asking you, do you believe you're objective?
I believe so.
So you are a fair, objective officer, is that right?
Yes,
And you would not have done the force in the same way that he did. That's what you testified to, is that correct? Under those exact circumstances.
one thing I would say to that is that, just very basically, I am not built the same as Rob Sanders. And I will tell you, as a female officer who is smaller in stature.
Can you answer the question I asked you, though? The question is,
Ask it again.
okay. Is it correct that you, in that exact same situation, as an objective, reasonable officer who's fair, would not have done the exact same thing that you testified to earlier?
I probably would not have done the exact same thing that he did, no.
Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes for a minute. It was a long talk. Is there an option in the IA findings to exonerate someone?
Yes,
But you chose not to do that.
correct.
because you did not feel like that was merited. Is that correct?
I think our interpretation of the unfounded findings, because we had used those same findings in previous use of force investigations, where force had clearly been used, but the recommended finding was based on the fact that we did not believe the force used was unreasonable. So we recommended unfounded as the finding, and those were put through and approved. Our understanding of that is that the acts complained of did not occur. Not that the incident or event itself did not occur, because those are two different things. So when we recommended unfounded, we very obviously were not trying to say that the event or the force didn't occur. That would be asinine. We were recommending unfounding the allegation of violations of those policies.
But my question really was, is exoneration is different than unfounded.
Exonerated, again, our understanding, our operating definition was that the acts complained of did occur, but were lawful and proper.
Okay. And let's get back to try to clear up some of the confusion. There are charges, you review, and you make a recommendation.
Correct.
And then it goes through the chain of command, and each person gets to make their own recommendation.
Correct.
And then the final and only person who can say yes or no is the chief of police.
Correct.
So, like we talked about earlier, you can't fire anybody.
No,
You can't suspend anybody.
no,
You can't do those things.
no.
Recross?
Briefly, thank you. We've been talking a little bit about this distinction between Chapter 19, 225, the abuse of an improper treatment versus the policies and procedures.
Yes.
And I think we've gone off on a tangent a little bit. But let me ask you this. Are you aware of any training, practice, scuttlebutt, where anybody's ever defined for you, other than the policy and procedures to which you are subject, what it means to be abusive or improper treatment, to be abusive to or improperly treat a prisoner?
I can't think of any specific training where that was ever discussed specifically. Indirectly, I mean, I think that training would address what expectations are, but as far as using that specific terminology, I don't recall that.
So there's no other handbook for the police officers besides policy and procedure that has a bunch of the, hey, this isn't in policy and procedure, but these are the things you got to do. There's nothing like that, is there?
No,
Has anybody ever talked to you about the fact that outside of policy and procedure, there is this amorphous topic of abusive and improper treatment of a prisoner?
no, nobody has talked to me about
Have you ever given any training on that?
that. No.
When you were a patrol sergeant, did you ever talk to your troops about that?
I did talk to my officers about proper treatment of people.
Dignity, respect, those sorts of things?
Objection, cutting off the witness's testimony.
Let her finish.
I was just going to say, it would have been in more general terms. I don't know that I would have used that terminology specifically. But those were absolutely discussions that I had with my officers about how to treat people respectfully.
Customer service.
I don't know that I would have used that terminology back then. Different terms, I would say, but the same idea.
This issue of whether Mr. Baker intended to damage property or not. You've seen those latches get damaged by people pounding on cell doors, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
And it doesn't matter whether they intended or not. The fact is that when you do that, it damages those doors sometimes, doesn't it?
Sometimes, yes.
And again, just because you wouldn't have done something differently doesn't mean that it was objectively unreasonable for someone to do it differently than you would. Isn't that true?
Sure,
Okay. Because every situation is different and every cop's different, right?
yes.
And the recommendation of Internal Affairs, as I heard you, I think, explain it here, is that unfounded means the allegation of misconduct did not occur, even though the underlying events did.
Correct.
There was a push, right?
Yes,
But it was not excessive force. That's the recommendation.
yes,
Okay. And the same is true for medical attention, yes?
yes,
And the same is true for abuse or improper treatment of a prisoner.
yes.
Exhibit 50, which is the pepper spray policy. You have any understanding that this was actually rescinded sometime? You have it?
Yes, I've got a copy of it. I believe it was rescinded, I believe maybe when our most recent version of the policy manual was adopted, but I'm not positive.
And when was that?
I don't recall the specific date.
Nothing further.
Questions from the board?
I have a quick read, really quick.
Okay.
Because that section applies to all city employees, it's actually a law, isn't it?
Yes, it's
It's
an
an ordinance. Everyone is deemed to know the law, isn't that correct?
Yes,
You don't get a defense from saying, hey, I can't assault anybody because I didn't know the law.
no, you don't get a defense for that.
And that's not the point. The point for all those corrective actions is to say, these are all charges for suspension or for termination for all city employees. They apply to everybody, is that correct?
Yes,
So if a janitor had come in and abused a prisoner, it would apply to them.
yes,
There is no specific training on that. It's, you don't do that, is that right?
I believe that would be the assumption to have it in the ordinance, but you don't do it.
Thanks.
Anything else, Mr. Jansen?
No, thank you.
Board members?
I do have a question because I'm still confused about what appear to be conflicting recommendations from IA. And the report which you indicated occurred on 9/15 or 9/16 says they were unfounded. The allegations were unfounded.
Yes,
And the memo which was sent to Mr. Sanders on the 19th, just several days later, says that the allegations were sustained. And in between that, evidently, there was the chain of review. And during that chain of review, it appears that 4 individuals sustained the first 2 allegations, but not the one about medical attention. So how did you get from unfounded on all 3 to sustained on all 3?
understood why that would be confusing. The notification of findings of the investigations were only sent to the officers after the investigation had been reviewed by the chain of command. Now, keep in mind, internal affairs, as both attorneys have said, our findings were really only recommendations. Those aren't binding. That's internal affairs doing the investigation and saying, based on the information we obtained in the course of the investigation, here are the findings we recommend. At the point that we completed that and made those recommendations, the report was then sent to the employee's chain of command, and at each level, they could review it and decide whether or not they concurred. Once it got to the chief, though, he has the final say in what the findings are, regardless of what our recommendations were, regardless of what the recommendations at any level in the chain of command were. Ultimately, the decision was up to him as to those findings. So after that went through the chief and he sustained all of those findings, that is what the notification of findings that was sent to Officer Sanders was based upon. The chief sustained the findings. So once he sustained them, our recommendations, the recommendations from the rest of the chain of command, they don't apply. Those were simply recommendations to the chief to make a decision. Once that decision was made, those were the findings, and that's what Officer Sanders was notified of.
But wouldn't that come from the chief and not from internal affairs?
The way that the process worked then is that we were the ones that sent out the notification of findings. There wasn't ever any other discussion about those coming from anybody but us. We would get usually that written form that wasn't filled out in this case, we would get that form back, and that's what we would base that notification of findings on. So no, those were not the internal affairs recommended findings, those were the final decision on the findings that were made by the chief.
But it was signed off by internal affairs and not the chief. I mean, that's, to me, not being involved in the CPD. Internal affairs would make their recommendation. The chief would then make his decision based on whatever evidence he felt was before him. That would not affect the internal affairs recommendation, but this appears to be what actually occurred.
Our recommendations were made in the investigation itself that was sent up. Once we made the recommendations, we weren't involved any further with the review. It really was us doing the investigation, compiling all of the information, recommending findings, and then turning that over to the employees chain up through the chief. Then it was really a matter of him making a decision, and then really as internal affairs, he just notified us of what that decision was, and then we notified the employees. So we were really kind of the, I guess, a conduit at that point. Once we turned the investigation and the recommendation for findings over, it was really just administrative. Our role was administrative from there on out.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully that answers it.
It does, thank you.
Other questions? Thanks, you really did clear that up for us. That was very confusing, very helpful what your explanation was. Either one of you want to have her subject to recall?
I would like to have her subject to recall for rebuttal.
Okay. All right, then you're going to need to stay around today. Think that would be much later today, or can she go do something else, or what's your thought? You just want her here?
You know what, Krista, I will undo that.
I'm not trying to talk you out of it.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Mr. Jansen, you don't need to see her again?
No, sir.
Okay, you're dismissed. Thank you very much. Call your next witness, please.
I'd like to call Chief